The following story contains sound effects that may be alarming to some listeners, and so may not be sleep-friendly. One of the many magical things about the Elder Scrolls games is the abundance of unexplained locations hidden around each game. Those locations that have no established lore. They are simply there in the game, waiting to be stumbled across and mused upon for a moment, before inevitably running along to the next quest. It's easy to imagine them being some development oversight, places that should have been fleshed out, but were overlooked due to time constraints, never to be prioritized or finished. I quite like that this is the case. It leaves players to their own imaginations, to come up with their own lore and explanations for what happened in these locations, even linking them in with their own characters' backstories for maximum immersion when roleplaying. But something I never thought I would learn in all my many years playing the Elder Scrolls games is how some of these locations do in fact have stories of their own. They hide traces of stories that touch upon higher things, unnamed forces and deep knowledge that extends far outside the boundaries of the game. Stories that might be better off buried. The following account is one such story. It began when a familiar itch came upon me. An itch that any who read this story will be all too familiar with. The itch to reinstall and play Oblivion for what very well may be the 1000th time. I yearned to emerge from the Imperial sewers, standing on a small wooden dock half blinded by the one sunlight, glinting off of the ruins of Vilverin across the waters of Lake Rumar. At this time I did not have Oblivion in my Steam library, so I opted to try and find a decent torrent of the Game of the Year edition. Taking to the high seas of the internet's torrent sites, I was soon scrolling through an abundance of torrents to choose from. One, in particular, stood out to me. Titled Oblivion Internal Beta, it consisted of an ISO for the game and a single text file titled Notes. The description of the torrent simply stated, "From Bethesda Internal Archives." Against my better judgment, I downloaded the torrent, but it was by no means a quick affair. Despite the fact that Oblivion's total file size comes in at around 6 gigabytes, the ISO file was almost 50 gigabytes in size. I assumed this meant that the contents were uncompressed, or that there was an abundance of cut content that bloated the game size to an absurd size for its time. Assuming that I wasn't shooting myself in the foot with malware, I began to grow excited at the prospect of seeing previously unseen aspects of Oblivion. The thoughts of experiencing a part of my favourite game's history firsthand banished all worry of malware or scams from my mind as I watched the torrent download. Once downloaded, I opened the text file to see if there were any major differences from the final release of the game. The text file was broken into loose headings that seemed to be rough updates on what had changed in this particular version of the game during the course of development at the time. The titles read Gameplay, Graphics, Bug Fixes, etc. I scrolled down to Graphics and began to read. It spoke of the graphical changes that had been implemented in that version of the game, and I was surprised to see the hefty system requirements listed there. They were insanely high for its time. I estimated that only a fraction of PC owners could even afford a build that could run it at even medium settings at 30 frames per second. The notes made mention of Oblivion being a PC exclusive and spoke about competition with Crytek's Crysis, which was set to release in 2007. Part of its appeal, it read, was that it would be a graphical powerhouse that would, if all went according to plan, be released before Crysis and showcase just how far PC graphics could be pushed. One feature mentioned was one that Todd Howard had spoken about in the E3 2005 demo, about how soil and rock formations could be accurately rendered for maximum realism. This feature had apparently been focused on in the version that I had downloaded, with reams of notes on geology lab data standing out amidst technical language that was lost on me. I assumed the textures wouldn't be all that different, but I held hope that Todd's claims were actually accurate for this version. Well, imagine my anticipation, knowing that I could max out the graphics being promised with a build that was more than 15 years more powerful than needed. When I launched it, the launch menu retained many of the same options that are present in the final release version, but the menu was bare and grey. I installed without issue and jumped straight in. The all too familiar title screen faded in, heralded by the triumphant opening strings of Reign of the Septims. The first thing I noticed when the game began was how different the graphics were. Even though it was only the character creation screen, the prison cell was rendered in such fine detail that it bordered on photorealistic. Each brick was solid and well defined, tessellated until you could feel you could run your hand across bricks, worn smooth by decades of dripping water and desperate, fumbling hands. Warm torchlight shone through the gate bars, casting shadows that seemed almost ray-traced in their softness and definition. Even the rust on the manacles dangling from the ceiling could be seen down to the last individual flakes dotting the aged iron. The beginning of the game rolled by as usual. I made my character as ugly as possible, as was tradition. That much remained familiar, at least. I created a stealth archer Argonian, hoping that my stealth would allow me to sneak by most encounters and see as much of this version of the game as possible. I sped through the sewer tutorial section, my desire to pause and admire the graphical differences in the gloomy lighting outweighed only by my desire to see the same fidelity applied to the outside world. I soon emerged once more into the fresh air on the banks of Lake Rumar. I was stunned at the detail of the sight before me, a sight familiar, yet renewed with such graphical fidelity that it felt like an entirely new game. All the landmarks were there. The dock by the water, the chalky white stone of Vilverin across the lake, the rolling grassy hills beyond. But all were rendered in such exquisite detail that I could barely believe that such visuals were achievable in 2006. The world felt larger too, as if they cut no corners when it came to creating a world one could truly get lost in. The Imperial City, for example, was a veritable metropolis that you could explore for literal hours, and that was before you even went near the side quests. Details could be seen that were not present before, small things that make all the difference when it comes to making a game world feel truly alive. Fish leaping from the lake, flocks of birds swooping through the sky, even small details that Skyrim would later include, such as insect colonies hard at work on mossy tree stumps. One strange feature was that enemies from the Shivering Isles were present in the base game. Knights and priests of order roamed the land, camping at ruins and forts throughout the map. I assumed that the plan was originally to cut them and incorporate them into later expansions, but seeing them in Cyrodiil was so out of place and unexpected that I couldn't help but be creeped out. It was the same feeling as coming home to find an object moved from its regular place, when you know it wasn't you who moved it. That vague disturbance of familiarity had me questioning what else would be different in the game that I knew so well. There didn't seem to be any sort of lore or quests surrounding them, so their goals were something I assumed would just tie into expansions later on. However, in the ruins they inhabited, the deepest chambers always seemed to end with hastily constructed mines, seemingly of their own creation. Pickaxes forged from order crystals littered the rubble. Caves, pre-existing mines, and even the walls of Ayleid ruins, all were bored through by the Knights of Order, burrowing ever downwards into the earth for reasons unknown. Eager to discover what their end goal was, I pressed on with the game, tempering my expectations of a payoff, as I reminded myself that I was playing a very much unfinished game, regardless of graphical polish. NPCs had new dialogue. That, of course, retained the same level of quality. Some NPCs kept mentioning earthquakes, saying, "Quakes are getting stronger lately. Dark times ahead." At first I hoped that this meant that developers had gone so far as to include natural disasters or geological activity. But the truth was more insidious. As I explored, earthquakes would shake the screen, and a long, deep growling sound could be heard. The growl sounded unlike anything I had heard in an Elder Scrolls game. In the few seconds it rumbled, the sound and textures of the game would glitch, blanketing the screen in a grey moire pattern and sending a static-laden screech through my headphones. At first I didn't think much of it. I assumed it to be tied in with the Oblivion crisis, that the quakes had something to do with the opening of the Oblivion gates, and that the rumbling growl would later be revealed to be the voice of Mehrunes Dagon or something along those lines. It wasn't until I decided to tackle one of my favourite quests that I began to learn more. I made my way to Coral to speak to Dar-Ma, triggering the beginning of the quest, a shadow over Hackdirt. It wasn't long before the trigger for her disappearance kicked in, and soon I was making my way south as gentle last seed rain fell from the grey skies above. I could practically smell the petrichor and the earth and damp of the woods around me as I made my way. With immersion like this, I felt, anything could await me. It was there in that forsaken little village buried in the woods that the true horror of the game began. I approached from the wilderness at night, the rain from earlier having become a heavy storm that obscured my approach. The village was situated in much the same location, but due to the overall larger size of the map, Hackdirt was larger too, and was different in some ways. It seemed to have been more well established before its fall to ruin. The remnants of proper roads ran into the village, and it seemed to have more shops and businesses that weren't just Moslin's inn and dry goods. A cold forge sat under a dilapidated shelter, with racks of rusted pickaxes and piles of moulding leather scraps. Hackdirt, it seemed, was well on its way to becoming a proper town before it fell to what I knew lay beneath the earth. What remained of it now was far more eerie than the vanilla game. Flickering lantern flames lit the muddy, half-cobbled streets. The chapel and the houses were all boarded up, lit faintly by pale, dull light behind musty windows. Broken crates and barrels littered porches and doorways, as if only a day had passed since they were ransacked by the bandits of the Black Dagger in the Second Era. Once or twice, I swore I saw shadows move behind the windows, as if they were hazarding quick glances outside for any would-be trespassers such as myself. As I strained to hear any steps or sounds of NPCs, all that could be heard was the pattering rain and a wind chime blowing in the night wind. I was playing a stealthy character, and so I opted to draw as little attention as possible, flitting between shadows and behind the many trees and bushes that offered cover in the burnt shells of houses. It seemed easy. Despite the larger version of this size of Hackdirt, no NPCs were present. I was on my own in those empty streets, the only sounds being the rain, wind, and my muffled footsteps. And so when the screen shook, and that terrible rumbling growl tumbled forth from my headphones louder than ever, I practically leapt from my seat. The quake and the growling seemed to be strongest here in Hackdirt, and that's when it occurred to me. The Deep Ones. What if the rumbling had nothing to do with the main quest, and was actually linked into this quest in Hackdirt? For a side quest to have such a prominent feature was highly unusual. Would it play a larger role in the overall plot? I needed to know more. I snuck into a random house on the outskirts of the village, assuming that I would find one of the trapdoors used by the Hackdirt Brethren to access the caverns beneath the town. The house was dimly lit, far darker than the lighting of the vanilla game. A small fire burned in the hearth across the room, illuminating the outline of the trapdoor that I sought. My path was not to be so clear. Silhouetted by the firelight was a man sitting on a small stool, voraciously stuffing something into his mouth with both hands. The bones and flecks of gristle littering the floor around him told me of what he gorged on. Very few of the bones seemed to be those of animals. I went to sneak by him, taking it slow so as not to trigger him or any brethren he might summon to his aid. As I crouched to sneak, a sickly realization came upon me. My crosshair, having turned into the shape of an eye to denote sneaking, was filled in. He was aware that I was there. But how? He hadn't moved. Maybe it was a bug or a glitch in the AI. No. He was looking at me. The silhouette that I thought had been facing the fire now craned his head back at me, twisted at an unnatural angle. I watched his jaw chew nonchalantly, the glint of teeth in the half-light and pulsing of overdeveloped jaw muscles suggesting the damnable shape of a smile. I drew my sword as the smiling man stepped close enough to see. His face was absolutely detestable. His mouth was spread wide, wider than any human. Dense blocky teeth lined his blackened gums. Flecks of blood and food matter plain to see in every pixel of graphical fidelity this version of the game offered. It was as if someone managed to blend the mouth of an ogre's 3D model in place of a human NPC's mouth. His eyes glinted black as polished onyx in the dull light, pinprick white pupils glaring at me through the eyes of my character as he swung madly with a barbaric club. I duelled with him, frantically dancing around the tight confines of the small house as I whittled down his unusually high HP. He was unusually tough despite his lack of armor. Through careful distancing and some desperate blocking at the cost of half my health, I struck him dead at last. As his body tumbled beside the fire, it knocked aside several bits of clutter. On closer inspection, I saw that the objects were lumps of meat and viscera, evidence of cannibalism not seen in the retail release. As I studied their disgusting detail, the light of the fire illuminated something else that I had not seen in the heat of the duel. A set of glistening gills lined the man's neck, red and raw, as if they had been stabbed into his neck during some depraved surgery. It was clear to see why the content had been cut from the game. Despite Bethesda being willing to not pull punches when it came to gore and darker aspects of their games, the atmosphere and sights I had seen were overwhelmingly dark in tone. The sense of oppression and malice I felt as I approached the trapdoor to the caverns beneath were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Where villains such as the Hackdirt Brethren can be recognized as evil or villainous, such words are mere superficial classifications for the vast majority of players who otherwise dedicate their mental faculties to simply enjoying the game, without any rumination on just how heinous these villains truly are. As I thought of poor, innocent Dar-Ma locked underground at the mercy of subhuman monsters like the one I just fought, a palpable sense of mean-spirited evil came over me. Bracing myself for whatever other horrors I was about to uncover, I hovered my cursor over the trapdoor for longer than I cared to admit, then entered. The cave from the original game was in place much the same as it was, though obviously in improved graphic detail. The first path I approached was the cave route suggested to lead to the deep ones in the original game, the small cave of collapsed rocks adjacent to a campfire covered in cold fog. I was taken aback to see that this path was no longer blocked by fallen rocks. Only the cold fog and depthless dark remained, beckoning me with answers to mysteries that had always played on my mind throughout the years. I couldn't refuse the call of deep knowledge such as this, even as an abject dread gripped me. It felt as if I were being watched by someone who meant me harm, someone or something who would hurt the things I loved. The malice, the sense of oppression and ill will permeated the very ambient sounds of the cave. Though I played the game in the comfort of my own home with the heating on full blast, a distinct chill came over me. After playing Oblivion for as long as I have, you lose the sense of trepidation that comes with stumbling blindly into the unknown darkness of caverns and ruins. Where once you would take tentative steps, always on the lookout for traps and enemies unseen, now only running headlong into the dark and speedrunning the cave was in order, with all fears overcome by sheer experience. But as the caverns loaded, I felt that old sense of trepidation once again, as I stared into the black depths never before seen in Oblivion, nor any Elder Scrolls game for that matter. The passage ended on a stony bridge running along the walls of a vast cave. Over the treacherously rounded sloped edge of the bridge was almost complete blackness. The barest light flooded through a thin crack running along the roof of the cave, where a continuous fall of the torrential rain from the surface above fell down into the dark. It was only in hindsight that I realized that the rain flooding from outside was an uncanny detail not present in the original game, but I was too stricken with awe and dread to notice as I peered into the depths. They went down further than the white gold tower was tall, and deeper still. Distant bridges like the one I stood upon were illuminated by the torchlight of Hackdirt Brethren, their lumbering gates seen as dim twinkles of movement as they moved like ants into sub-caves lining the walls. I ventured across the bridge and into the mouth of a nearby sub-cave, intending to make my way downwards. I had to see how far it all went, what secrets it all held. I made my way with stealth, relying on crevices in the cave walls and scattered supply crates and barrels to hide behind when patrols of brethren walked past. More than once I ran afoul of them, their large black eyes clearly adapted to live in the same realm as their infernal objects of worship. Were it not for my character's abundant experience and supplies, I'd never have been able to recover from the brethren's mad attacks. The cavern was vast enough to make Skyrim's Blackreach feel like a shallow mineshaft. After what must have been a full hour, I began to near the bottom. I attempted to speed things along by taking shortcuts down narrow chutes in certain sections, with no shortage of save scumming. My first descent landed me in a reeking pile of fly-mottled bones and viscera. Impaled into this pile were foul totems covered in letters similar to Daedric script, but different somehow. They were slender, less jagged than the Daedric script, a certain otherness about them. Whether they were offerings to the Deep Ones, or just charnel piles of waste, I idled around them no longer than I had to. The silence of the cavern was soon broken by the sound of battle and running water as I neared the bottom. Gazing outside of the sub-cave entrance, I witnessed some Knights of Order do battle with a horde of Hackdirt brethren. While better equipped, more skilled and more durable than the brethren, the knights were fewer in number. They were worn down and beginning to lose as lions lose to hyenas. I saw the last knight fall to a flurry of mad, brutal bludgeoning from a mob of 10 brethren, all wielding crude rusted cleavers and barbaric clubs. As his body fell, the brethren kept attacking, panting heavily and growling like beasts as they bombarded the dead knight with insensate rage. Impossibly, the knight's body was hacked asunder. I was so shocked to see dismemberment in the game that I did not even notice the altar next to a cascading waterfall to the right of the brethren. The mob held up the pieces of the knight, limbs chopped into crude lumps of order crystal, to be held aloft as offerings to the Deep Ones. I snuck behind some large rocks hidden in darkness beside the river for a better look. The altar was a large wooden platform, constructed from rickety damp planks and rusted nails. Kneeling upon the altar were 3 people, bound and gagged. In the dull torchlight, I saw the vivid scales and tails of Argonian forms. Some shifted languidly, alive but exhausted. One of them was the object of my quest, Dar-Ma. I mused on how best to save her while the mob continued their foul mass. One brethren ascended the altar, his meaty arms dragging a massive axe up each step with heavy thuds. The Argonian nearest him began to squirm as he realized what was happening, the imminent threat of death or worse, lending frantic impetus to his previously sluggish movements. Several more brethren seized him, holding him steady and shoving his head down and forward by his horns. A lone woman stood in the center, throwing her arms wide as she addressed the mob. I realized it was Etira Moslin, the owner of Hackdirt's dry goods store in the original game. Her voice sounded different from the vanilla game. It was younger, more unhinged, and with a different accent. It was as if her dealings with the Deep Ones had kept her young, at the cost of her sanity.
Gathered brethren, we stand here today in the sacred caverns of the Deep Ones. Those who gave us blessed ore, fragments from the foundations of the void. Gnawed free from the pillar that upholds all, given to us so that we may live and prosper, when so many of the surface world's fools saw fit to cast us aside to be preyed upon like cattle. This day, we honor those gifts.
She paused to beckon forth one of the mob who carried a Knight of Order's severed arm. With her other hand, she indicated for the axe-wielding brethren to begin his cruel work. I expected him to decapitate the Argonian man, but instead, he stepped behind him. With sudden and unrestrained brutality, he began to hack at the Argonian's back. The Argonian howled in agony, but was held tight by the brethren. So heavy were the blows that the brethren holding the Argonian lurched forward with each hit as they struggled to hold their victim steady. A horrible thought occurred to me that the Argonian, being possessed of immunity to most poisons, would likely have felt every moment with nothing to dull the pain, assuming they saw fit to sedate him at all. Etira continued on, speaking haughtily over the Argonian's screams, as unperturbed as a priest speaking over a crying child. The brethren who had carried the arm kneeled before her in quiet reverence, his bulbous head bowed low.
An arm for those who wish to oppose us, forcefully taken as our home was in years past, forged from the foundations gnawed on by the Deep Ones as we speak.
Etira held it aloft briefly, looking intensely into the blackness of the distant open caverns to my left. I followed her gaze, scanning the dark for what she looked toward. All sound dimmed, the flowing water and flickering torches muffled as if underwater. As I peered into the blackness, I shifted in my chair in the real world, suddenly anxious under the gaze of what might be looking back at me. The silence was abruptly shattered by a frenzied shout, followed by muffled growling. Etira had handed the limb to the kneeling brethren. He greedily began to gnaw on it, his huge teeth and enlarged jaws cracking into the crystal and chewing with religious fervour. Shards of the crystal pierced his gums, and a visible trail of spit and blood ran free from his accursed maw as he gorged himself. The axe-wielding brethren had finished his grim task by the time the arm was eaten, and it was now horribly clear what torture they had in mind for the poor Argonian. Using brutal tools, the other brethren pried apart his ribs, exposing his lungs beneath. It was the exact same as the Blood Eagle, a Viking torture method where the ribs are splayed wide like wings. Even as the Argonian bled out, Etira reached into his chest and heaved forth his lungs without any grace or precision. She held them aloft with the same reverence as the knight's arm.
Lungs of the Argonian, taken so that we may breathe as they do, and swim the waters of the void where the deep ones gnaw eternal.
The brethren who had eaten the knight's arm kneeled before her, smiling a wide bloody smile as he eagerly awaited Etira's next move. Etira lowered the handful of lungs over his head, where he opened his maw wide in a foul imitation of a feeding chick. Dropping them in, he swallowed in a single gulp without even chewing.
A brother ascends today, teeth fit for gnawing, and now lungs fit for breathing.
As she proclaimed those words, cold fog started to waft from the brethren's neck. Raw gashes formed on either side, as if an invisible cleaver bluntly ripped wounds open rather than cut them cleanly. The brethren choked, his guttural hacks better suited to the throat of a grummite than to that of a man. Clutching his blood-crusted nails at his new gills with a mix of rapturous joy and fear, he stumbled towards the stream. He dived in headlong, as if it were the only thing in the universe that mattered to him. I saw his shape flit by in the fast current, following the river that snaked its way into the darkness of the cavern beyond. With his passing, the ritual seemed to come to a close, and all present dispersed into the numerous sub-caves and shacks dotted around the area. If I was to save Dar-Ma, now would be my best chance. I prayed that they would not commence another ritual soon. The altar was left abandoned while the brethren busied themselves by campfires and huts, speaking in foul whispers and chewing on hunks of barely cooked meat. If Dar-Ma was as good at stealth as she was in the vanilla game, I might be able to free her and sneak out. I dreaded to think what could happen if we were discovered, especially seeing as my own character was an Argonian too. I hugged the cavern wall to my right, sneaking around the rocks and keeping to the shadows that led around the curvature of the wall and towards the altar. I instinctively avoided stepping in water. I did not know if doing so would create noise that would alert the brethren, but at that point I was so immersed that it was the most natural thing to do. I now stood at the rear of the altar with only a small set of stairs before me. I ascended them slowly, scanning for any brethren who might have moved position, making sure that no bulging black eyes were upon me. As I approached Dar-Ma, a dialogue box appeared. It read,
"Who are you?"
The response read, "It's me, Dar-Ma. Sidney sent me to rescue you."
Oh, thank goodness. Hurry, and let's be gone from this horrible place. But please, you must help this poor man too.
The other Argonian said nothing, his head bowed in somber silence. I untied Dar-Ma and gently dropped the steel short sword I had in my inventory from an earlier quest, hoping she would reach for the nearest weapon, as she did in the vanilla game. I reached to untie the other Argonian, but as my character's hands touched his, he flinched and let out a fearful yelp. His cry was so pathetically real, my heart ached at his torment. It was devoid of all voice acting glamour, rendered painfully real, as if the voice actor had called upon the deepest wounds in his own mind to bring this Argonian's pain to life. I had no time to pity him for even a moment longer. His cry had drawn the attention of every brethren in the vicinity. As they rushed the altar where Dar-Ma and I stood like deer in headlights, I readied my weapon, thinking that Dar-Ma's AI would have her do the same. I was shocked to see her jump straight for the river where the mutated brethren had swam earlier, with a hurried cry of,
"Follow me!"
Whether this was a scripted event, or vastly superior AI to the vanilla game, I was grateful for a means of escape. I dived in after her, swept along by the freezing black currents deeper into the cavern. I hoped that this would, in a swift conclusion to the quest through convenient design, lead out of the underground cavern into an open ground, or even down an underwater tunnel into Lake Rumar or some other body of water. I soon learned that a swift and happy ending to this quest was too much to hope for. Deeper and deeper the current went, running like veins through the earth where no light could ever reach. It swept us far too quickly to fight against, and without light, I could not see where to go, even if I could. All I could do was float and watch. I would have died a merciful death if my character had been any other race, but as an Argonian, I was now damned to breathe ice-cold water that no gills had ever known, so far beneath the earth that I might as well have been cast to oblivion. I sat and watched my screen, trying to discern if anything of note would appear. As I strained to see in the dark, I could swear that I saw movement in the dark, quick slithers of black against black, moving through the inscrutable darkness, but nothing ever appeared. After 10 full minutes of tumbling and gliding through the caves, we emerged into what appeared to be a vast, wide-open space. The only indication was a faint light from a directionless source, illuminating Dar-Ma and my character. We floated in a massive black void with no features whatsoever. It was as if we had reached the absolute limits of the game, where only total nothingness remained. Illuminated so unnaturally, I felt exposed, hapless prey floating for some indescribable maw to emerge from the infinite dark. As I scanned the screen for any indication of what I was to do next, a glimmer caught my eye far below me, or what was below me as far as I could tell. Baleful light shimmered and swam, blurred to obscurity by what could have been miles of water. With no other option, I swam towards it, Dar-Ma following close behind. My screen was riddled with visual effects not seen in the base game. My character's vision swam with a blur that felt at odds with the simple gauze of the water, and the effect intensified in pulses as I drew nearer to the light. I became vaguely aware that as I drew nearer, the muffled sloshing sound of my character swimming became quieter, dulling to near silence as I neared the source of the light. As I neared the light, I realized it was no light at all. It was a portal, hundreds of meters wide. It did not resemble any sort of portal in the original game. It was like a massive gash bitten open in the fabric of reality. And what lay on the other side was so vast, so utterly alien, that I sat dumbstruck as I tried to wrap my head around what it was that I was seeing. Grey waters that plunged deeper outside of all sight and time. Inconceivably vast pillars reaching from the void, holding up all realms understood by men and mer. Nirn and its moons, the plains of Oblivion, the light of Etira, and many stars and planets throughout, all swirled like a tiny coloured candle flame atop a pillar of unmelting wax. Beneath it all, I see them. The Deep Ones. Wriggling like maggots on a gangrenous limb, gnawing away the crystal pillar upholding everything that was known. They blanketed the pillar, cavernous maws gnawing fragment by fragment, covering it all the way into the depths of the grey void further than was thinkable. One swam past the portal through which I gazed, and I was dumbstruck at how inconceivably vast the thing was. Each scale must have been the size of Cyrodiil alone, and my mind reeled as I saw its many thousands of scales float past as it swam to join its even more numerous kin. A frantic sloshing beside me snapped me from my daze, and I saw Dar-Ma swimming away in blind panic, her eyes bulging from their sockets as she desperately clawed her way away from the horrific sight. I attempted to speak to her, but I was unable to activate conversation as my cursor turned into the basic crosshair, indicating that Dar-Ma could not be interacted with for now. The reason was soon apparent. Several of the guild brethren had been following us the entire time, and had only now come upon us having arrived from the tunnel. I followed Dar-Ma, as eager to get away from the portal and the brethren as she was. She swam towards the surface, at least what she may have thought was the surface. As I followed, I chanced to glance over my shoulder. Illuminated by the baleful grey light, I saw several brethren swimming through, bulging black eyes and gaping maws held wide in ecstatic jubilation. Dar-Ma and I had clearly been forgotten. What mad apotheosis those creatures would undergo over the course of deep time once they crossed into those grey waters would be something no one would ever know. After an arduously long swim spent constantly watching all around me for unseen enemies, we arrived at the surface of a subterranean pool. It's funny how much one's senses can be altered by way of immersion into fictional senses. The sound of open air, unmuddied by water, made me feel as if my own real-world ears had been unclogged, despite having been wearing my headphones the entire time in the comfort of my own home. After navigating an abandoned mine, sneaking past only a handful of goblins, we reached the true surface at last. Dar-Ma turned to speak to me.
I'll make my own way home from here. Thank you. I just need to go home.
The way she uttered the last words conveyed a poignant need for comfort and solitude. The kind of retreat from hardship and madness that a journey like the one we had been on would instill in anyone, no matter how hardy. Checking the map showed that we had ended up in a mine, somewhere at the foot of the Vallis Mountains, just below the snowline where Doomed Mine is located in the vanilla game. Despite not needing to, I chose to accompany her back to Coral. We had evidently traversed the breadth of Cyrodiil in those underground caverns. A leisurely stroll back was the least I could do. But a leisurely stroll it was not. Quietly we walked, with Dar-Ma being a quiet shadow of herself the entire journey. I watched her expression. Despite the clunkiness of Oblivion's animations and expressions, there was a distinct hollowness to her gaze. I had never seen such exhaustion, such somberness communicated so well in any Elder Scrolls game. I pondered the distance as we travelled, every road, every forest, every village, the sheer vastness of it all. Beyond it all, the vastness of the entire world. Further still, the moons, the stars, the plains of Oblivion, all just a tiny flicker in the eyes of hungering gods. We arrived in Coral before long, with Isnain giving her heartfelt thanks for Dar-Ma's safe return. The quest concluded in much the same way as it did in the base game, but Dar-Ma was never the same again. After that, I played on as I usually would. I tackled a ton of side quests, seeing as much as I could of the game and progressing as far into the main quest as I could. As my save file grew in size, the game grew more unstable, freezing and stuttering more frequently with each session. Eventually the game crashed, and my saves were irretrievably corrupted when I started it up again for the final time. What stayed with me to this very day were the bonus dialogue options from the main quest characters that I unlocked having completed the Hackdirt quest. When speaking to Martin Septim, an option appeared that let you ask him about the Deep Ones.
Yes, the Deep Ones. They are unto the gods, as the gods are unto us. Utterly inconceivable. Operating on another set of rules entirely. It is within our power to stop Mehrunes Dagon. But as for those things, not even the gods may know how to close shut the jaws of those that gnaw at the foundations of Oblivion.